If you like the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment. For more videos like this, people who live in small towns, rural areas, the middle of nowhere, etc. What was the creepy event, legend, myth, or encounter that happened to you there? When I was about 13, I was out a few miles behind my childhood home in a dense part of the woods where a small creek ran. All day I had been exploring it, finding cool plants, rocks, and little creatures. It was getting dark, and on my way out of the woods, by the stream, I swear I saw a person crouching down to the water, but it didn't quite look like a person. I only saw this from the back, but this thing looked like their skin was the texture of a pig. Black and pink spots with a bit of hair all over. They had darker hair on the head, and they were just smaller altogether than a normal person. I was absolutely scared out of my mind and just remembered running home. Never did I return to that creek or venture into those woods again. Living out in the middle of nothing is quite an experience, and I can't even count all of the weird stuff I've heard out there. One time, me and a friend were out the back of my house near our chicken coop taking out mice traps when we heard this blood-curdling scream that didn't sound human at all. We stopped and looked at each other, were frozen for a few seconds, and asked each other if we had just heard that. Then we heard a man who sounded like he was struggling, and then he screamed again. It sounded like an alien or something, basically, just ducked and ran inside and didn't go back out for the rest of the night. Another one is that for a few days in a row, we kept finding dead rats placed in rows at our back door, like rats from a pet shop just dead and lined up, weird as duck. Some other weird SHT. It's a weird town. We have the official most haunted road in the US. I thought it was just because it's super windy and narrow and the trees lean in on you, but there's a ton of stories about this road. There used to be a hairpin turn, fixed a few years ago, that led straight into the lake from the right direction. Back in the 80s, a car went over the edge, and a young boy drowned. Sometimes, before it was moved, you could see him sitting on the barrier, waving at you. There's a tall white woman in a flowing white dress who just stands in the middle of the road and stares you down with her hands over her heart. Flashing your headlights and slowing down can make her go away. There's a pair of floating red eyes that move through the woods at night. No one has ever seen what they belong to. Sometimes a truck will appear on the road behind you and ride really close for a bit, then vanish, only to reappear a few minutes later, and occasionally run people off the road. There are rumors of a cannibalistic albino colony living in the deep woods. I live in a fairly rural area of Wisconsin. This happened to a close friend of mine. There were woods behind his house that went on for acres. We would always explore in there. There was one area where we would see random burn marks on trees. I always figured it was kids with fireworks or some shit. One day, it was just him and his brother, exploring. They went near the area where we would typically find the burn marks. This time there were burn marks that made a circle with the trees they were on, if you were to connect the dots. In the center, they found a perfectly clean skull of some mammal, probably a raccoon, and that's it. Now they keep the skull in their barn that we hang out in. Always creeped me out, but I've always been too scared to move it. So a very good friend of mine was deer hunting in rural Pennsylvania late into the evening. It was pretty dark, and he was waiting for his dad to pack up and pick him up on the ATV. He was on the ground in a blind when he saw two large yellow eyes looking at him from only a few yards ahead. They stared unmoving at him for around 20 minutes, and whenever he tried to shine a flashlight at them, the brush seemed to conceal whatever was connected to the eyes. He couldn't see fur or a body at all. They appeared to be maybe 3 feet off the ground, so he eventually gives up and assumes it's a bobcat or something. As soon as the TV gets close, however, the eyes stand up to a height of about 7 feet. Whatever it is quickly makes a sharp turn to the right and sprints away. It doesn't amble or gallop like a bear might on 2 legs, it sprints like someone running track. He believes it to be Bigfoot. I don't believe a flesh and blood Bigfoot could exist in Pennsylvania. But who can say? A few hours ago, I was in a car traveling by some rural area and looking out the window, where I saw a group of goats in the not-so-far distance. There were about 100 different colored goats. Some had their heads down on the ground like they were eating grass, and some were just standing around. It was a normal sight to see in a rural area until I noticed there was no movement there at all. I got to take a look carefully for about 20 seconds, and during that time, the whole herd was completely motionless. None of the goats moved at all in any way. They were just completely stuck as they were. I am sure what I saw was real, and there really was a weird group of goats that just did not move for more than 20 seconds. What the hell was that? This happened to my husband when he was a teenager in rural Oklahoma. He and his buddies had left a party and were driving back. After hitting several mile sections, he pulled off into a pasture to get more beer out of the back of the truck. The alfalfa field they parked in had a half-moon-shaped tree line that stretched the size of a football field. When he got back into the truck, his friend told him there was someone in the trees watching them. Both of them jumped out of the truck and shined a spotlight into the thickets in front of them. He said that everywhere he shined the light, there was an 8 to 10 foot tall Indian man in rags staring back at them. It or him would be wherever they moved the light to shine. Needless to say, they pissed themselves and got out of there. I'm from Bladenboro, North Carolina, population 1,600, where the beast of Bladenboro is from. To my knowledge, a bunch of livestock were killed over the course of a few summers, and unidentifiable prints were found. I think a bunch of dogs ended up being attacked too. A lot of them were in places a coyote or whatever couldn't easily get to. The animals were found basically torn to shreds, and some people reported sightings of a beast. What's really weird about it is that the heads of the animals were apparently smashed by whatever the thing was. The common consensus around here is that it was a black mountain lion, but some old people around here might tell you it couldn't have been one for XYZ reasons. To their credit, those don't really live anywhere around here. We also have a festival every October before Halloween called Beast Fest. The festival is in quotes since the town is so small. It's nothing fancy, you can get carnival food, and the kids have little rides they can go on. If you have friends to hang out with while you're there, it's pretty fun, but I wouldn't say you should bother traveling any distance to get there. Just my opinion, though. It beats the usual Bladen County recreation of hanging out in a Walmart parking lot. A light shines into the sky a couple times from out in the woods. The police went out to check it and found a man no one knew in a cabin no one knew of, loaded with guns and ammunition. When asked why he had so many, he said that what he was doing was shining a light into the sky. He was sending a beacon to the aliens because they told him to shine a light to guide them when he had things ready for them. Yeah. About 6 years ago, my family and I moved from the West Coast to the Midwest. Dad and I drove while my mom and younger siblings flew. Dad was driving the U-Haul, and I was driving the van that we had at the time. We stopped for dinner around 8 and realized we had about 6 hours of driving left and decided to push on through. GPS took us a very weird way and had us exit on a rural highway instead of staying on the interstate. So we are following this little windy road for what seems like forever. It's just past midnight when, all of a sudden, we are in this little town. Everything seems old, and the houses feel like they are 10 feet from the road. There's not a single street light in this town, so the only light is from our cars. We get to the house, and my dad doesn't say anything about the town, so I assume it was my mind playing tricks on me. A few days later, I tell the story to my mom, and she tells me Dad told her the exact same story, but I thought since I didn't mention it that it must have been his mind playing tricks. I've tried to find this town again on many occasions, and I have never had any luck. Our little corner of SW, Missouri was explored by Spanish soldiers in search of treasure in the early to mid-16th century. It is said that during one of these expeditions, a force of conquistadors arrived and built a fort on top of a mountain they called El Azafate, or bread tray, due to the mountain's strangely flat peak. From this fort, they mined silver until they were slaughtered by local Native Americans. 300 years later, following the Lewis and Clark expedition, white settlers began arriving in the region, and they rediscovered the abandoned fort and, according to rumors, the secret Spanish silver mine. According to local legend, the sounds of fighting and dying Spaniards can be heard in the vicinity on certain nights. It is also said the mine is cursed either by the bloody, horrible deaths of the Spaniards or because it is in a cave sacred to the native tribes. The family that owned the property in the late 1800s lost 2 members, a son and his young wife, and their ghosts are said to haunt the entrance to the mine where they died extracting silver. Perhaps the mine entrance collapsed and the family was unable to open it again? Perhaps the ore just played out, and the family moved on. Over time, the true location of the mine was lost to history, but the myths and legends persist. Lifelong Alaskan. I was walking through the woods with my dogs and 2 younger siblings when we came upon a fresh leg sticking up out of the snow. No skin, but meat, and sticking like it was standing upright and not covered in any snow or ice yet. It was like something had just walked away without its legs, bones, or muscles. My sister worked at a dog kennel, so I know moose legs fairly well. People feed them to their dogs all the time. This wasn't that. The shape was wrong. It could have been from a black bear, maybe. That's sort of what I've always thought. I considered digging down to see if there was a foot in the ground somewhere, because it looked so much like there ought to be, but there was just this weird feeling in the woods. They were really quiet that day, no ravens or anything. They usually followed us around a bit back then, making rackets and stealing snacks. We ran straight home to get our parents, but when we went back to show them the leg, it was gone. Alaska's a bit weird, isn't it? I was just chilling in my room, playing some games late at night. I was playing with my headphones on, but I heard a faint sound, like someone stepping on grass. So I took off my headphones and slowly opened the curtains, and there wasn't anything. I assumed it was a raccoon since there were many of them where I lived. I went back to my game, and not even a minute later, I heard the grass crunching again. I didn't bother to look, because I thought it was an animal or something. I kept playing my video game, and eventually I noticed that the crunching sound had been going on for definitely more than a few minutes. I felt confused and scared. I didn't want to open my curtains. I thought maybe it was someone who was scouting my house to break in. I was scared shitless and felt sick. The crunching sounds were still going on as I mustered the courage to look through the curtains. I opened the curtains again, and the sound stopped. When I looked at the road that was in front of my house, there was a ducking terrifying creature. The ducking thing was at least 9 feet tall. It was unhuman, and I still feel sick and scared writing this. I don't know if I was hallucinating, but I ducking hope I was. So around a week or two ago, I was hanging out with my friend, who lives about a half hour away from me. I headed back out to my place sometime in the evening. At this point, I was about 5 minutes from my house on the highway. I live in a very rural area, and there were barely any cars on the road as it was getting dark and late. As I was driving, a single very bright light appeared in my rear view, directly behind me. I thought that it was a motorcycle, and it seemed to be getting closer, so I moved into the slower lane for it to pass. The road dipped downhill, and as it did, the bright light got covered by the hill. However, when the road leveled back out, the light disappeared completely. As I'm contemplating what that single light I saw was, it comes back again and does the same exact thing, disappearing over a hill again. Just to freak me out, this happened 2 more times with around the same amount of time between each. The last time it happened, it looked like it was about to follow the same turn I took home but disappeared again. Growing up, my family frequently traveled to rural Mexico. Almost everyone there believes in supernatural things and is very superstitious. I am honestly skeptical about many things, but I did see a few things I can't explain. This is one of them. Light orbs. Growing up, I heard many stories of strange light orbs. Everyone believes they are witches. One of my uncles, who was a retired soldier, woke up one day as usual to feed his sheep at 6 a.m. He said he saw a big orb flying above his barn. He watched it for a few minutes and decided the best thing to do was shoot it with a rifle. He says it was a Vietnam-era M4. He fired a few shots, and he saw they hit the orb, which was spinning like crazy. The orb charged towards him, and he ran inside his house. He waited all day and night inside. He believes it was a witch. I loved that story as a child but thought it was just a lie until I got to see them. In Mexico, it is common for teenagers to go party in the next town over. One of my cousins had a truck, and it would get filled inside the cab and on the bed. In total, there were maybe 12 of us. On our way back around 1 a.m., I was riding in the back of the truck and was tired, so I wasn't paying any attention to my surroundings until the truck stopped. Someone inside pointed at a small hill that had a cemetery on top. There were 3 orbs circling about 20 feet around the cemetery. The orbs had to be the size of a Volkswagen Beetle. We were about half a mile away. We all just stared at them for about 3 minutes. They would circle the cemetery, drop to the tombs, and then go back up. Then, all of a sudden, they just went up and didn't come back down. I have to admit, I was yelling at my cousin to go. I was afraid I didn't want to die to a glowing orb. Growing up, I lived in an extremely low-income, tiny, rural town. I.e., nothing interesting ever happened, save for the occasional drug bust or repo job. Well, one night, this unfathomably large aircraft glided just above our town, almost hitting the trees, and nearly blacked out the sky because of its massive scale. It was dead silent, and definitely not of any military technology seen in the world. Obviously, it became the talk of the town, and not long after, the military personnel in town were talking about how nobody knew what it was on the closest, National Guard/US Army, base. Not long after that, any prints or media about it were completely scrubbed, and for a while, the area became a hotspot for combat-oriented military aircraft patrols. We never did hear anything definitive about what it was, but it was definitely strange nonetheless, and nothing like the town had ever seen before. I know some people might be curious, the UFO was comparable to the ship in Independence Day in its sheer scale. As a bonus story, I guess I now live in Colorado, and one of the most prominent local legends is of Riverdale Road, one of the most haunted roads in the world. That is an entire topic in itself, but there is definitely some otherworldly shit going on there. I've experienced it myself, and it was not a comfortable experience. I used to live alone in northern rural Minnesota, near the Canadian border. in a cabin as a seasonal employee, and one winter night I was trying to go to sleep at 2 a.m. when I heard the weirdest echo of an evil male laugh ever. The laugh that I heard was exactly like a horror movie laugh. It lasted about a minute, then faded away slowly. I was in disbelief and thought maybe it was my phone, so I took a look at it, and it wasn't. I believe the laugh came from the outside.
For a second, I thought someone was playing a joke on me, but there was a snowstorm happening, and it was too late.
People from the company used to live about an hour away, and I did not have any roommates. I got up and looked outside by the window, but I did not see anything. I often asked myself how a laugh could be heard so clearly and pitched with a snowstorm and strong winds happening, plus the slow fading made it even creepier. I had never heard anything like it before. It was very clear, dark, and malicious. After a year, the company contacted me back home, asking if I wanted to work there again, and because of the laugh that I heard, I declined. I just moved to a super rural area. You can drive miles without seeing a single other vehicle. It's all nature and pretty. But sometimes it's eerie. I stayed late at work last night, so for the first time, I had to make the 15-mile drive home in the dusky evening. It wasn't pitch yet, but it was dark, and we have no street lights out here. I saw maybe 2 vehicles the whole way. About 5 minutes from home, I started getting a prickling, eerie sensation, and my gut instincts put all my senses on high alert. Bears, wolves, and coyotes are not out of place here. So I thought maybe I was sensing a predator. I slowed down because I didn't want anything to jump out in front of my car. I round a huge curve, and several yards ahead of me is what appears to be the back end of an old Navy and cream Dodge pickup driving ahead of me. It only caught my attention because I couldn't see a headlight glow in front of them, and then I realized I didn't see any taillights either. The prickly feeling increased, and I thought of trying to flag them down by flashing my brights, but my gut instinct said no. I squinted at them, and I was coming up to my turn, so I slowed down, glanced at my road, glanced back, and literally, in front of my eyes, watched it fade into translucency and then nothing. There was a moment there where I could see through the damn thing. If the road wasn't literally at my apartment, I think I would have needed to pull over to collect myself. The feeling faded nearly as soon as the truck did. I live in the Central Valley of California, where there are many orchards and open fields. I particularly live in a very small, populated town in the country, helping operate a new almond orchard. I was driving home from a friend's house just after midnight when I turned onto my home street. There is a single other house about 200 feet off the road. It was 1 a.m., and just outside the house was a small shed with a dim orange light above it. As I was driving closer to pass the house, I thought there was a wooden post right in front of the shed, but as I got closer, it looked more and more like a person. I slowed down in front of their driveway and was able to confirm it was a woman. She stood alone in front of the light, staring at the ground. She was wearing a nightgown and looked about 40-ish with red hair. I waited for what felt like forever for her to move, but she stayed perfectly still. I started to feel afraid of whatever was going on, so I locked the car doors, turned on the lights, and sped home. I avoid driving late at night around my area. I used to be a cop in rural America. One day I get a well-being call. I drive to the address, which is just a few minutes outside town. When pulling into the property, I get an eerie feeling. I go to the residence, which was an older modular, trailer, home. The front door had a diamond-shaped window. After knocking for a bit, I began to hear noises sounding like walking from the barn next to the residence. I was shining my flashlight around the property as it was night, and I had the feeling I was going to turn around and see someone standing in the window of the door. I checked the barn and could not locate anyone or the source of the sound. After several minutes of knocking and no answer, I returned to service. The glitch, I left the residence and drove back towards town. While on my way, I called a friend or coworker and was telling him about the strange feeling and sounds on the call. I was on the phone with him for over 15 minutes and realized I was nowhere near town. After several more minutes of driving, I turned around and headed back towards the residence. I arrived at the driveway in a little over a minute. I turned around again, drove back towards town, and made it in just a few minutes. I don't know why it took so long. I can't explain it at all. Bonus, to cap off the creepiness, after I arrived back in town, the individual I went to check on called into my dispatch and thanked me for coming to check on him. He said he was watching me the entire time. I lived in the middle of nowhere, Oklahoma, for most of my life. Animal-wise, pumas screaming is terrifying, and once I was walking from my house to my parents', 2 houses, same land, and a huge deer came charging right past, within touching distance, breathing hard, immediately followed by the biggest coyote I've ever seen in my life. It was super strange because it was utterly silent. Just two wild animals were running as fast as they could. Non-animal wise, I was following a creek that's near our land. It's not super dangerous, and we spend a lot of time there. I was headed upstream with my dog, and I came across one of those porta-potty deer blind things. Okay, pretty normal for the backwoods. Kept walking. I came upon a crappily made tin building. Okay, maybe a handmade deer blind or something. Kept walking. Then I saw a ragged military-issue tent that someone was clearly living in. Random animal skins strung up to tan outside, odds and ends, and bits of metal strung up everywhere, smoke coming from a chimney on the roof of the tent. There was nobody around, but I got the hell out of there quick, fast, and in a hurry. I even called my mom on the walk back, saying, if I die, tell the cops to check the hobo tent in the woods. My town is in Bavaria, or Franconia, to be precise. There are other parts of Bavaria, like the Oberpfalz, Upper Palatinate. We don't like them, don't ask me why, that's just a thing. Imagine Vikings Packers, Spurs Arsenal, Juventus Napoli, that kind of rivalry is completely unrelated to sports. Anyway, we have a church, and at the beginning of the 20th century, 1901, I believe, there was a pastor who died during a thunderstorm while standing under a tree. Nothing too unusual, but legend says that he had a fling with a girl from the Oberpfalz. My village is located right at the border, and he was a Protestant, so there was no celibacy. People in our town used to say don't get involved with people from there and took it as a sign of God when he died. As in, he punished him for hooking up with a girl from over there. He wasn't even allowed to be buried in our town, and the guys from Upper Palatinate had to bury him. Since then, it's kind of like a running gag with people from the neighboring villages, but in 1901, people were really serious about it and shunned people in the village who were from the Oberpfalz. But there's something else. Even though there was no grave at our graveyard, the people in the village who really liked him still honored him with a little memorial. They put up a cross right next to a tree. This tree is pretty special, too. It was planted in the 1870s after the Franco-Prussian War that led to the formation of the German Empire at Versailles. It was planted by the elders in the village. Legend says you can hear the voice of the pastor preaching during a thunderstorm in the summer. Also, lightning struck the tree 3 times already. This happened 2 days ago, but it's still freaky. My grandma and I were both outside when, out of nowhere, I heard what sounded like chanting or singing. I looked at my grandma to see if it was just me who was hearing it, but she was also looking around as well. It started off faint but kept on getting louder and louder. At first, it sounded like it was coming from the woods, but it also sounded like it was coming from different directions all at once. It sounded like Celtic or monk chanting, but I think I could hear male and female voices. Then it got fainter and fainter until we couldn't hear it anymore. We could hear for about 5 or 6 minutes. It was weird. My grandparents live in a rural area with barely any neighbors, so it's not like it could have come from a neighbor's home. The only church is in the town where I live with my parents, but it's miles away from my grandparents' home. I live in a rural area, and there is a super long back road that connects the 2 parts of town. Normally, you get to the midway point, but you can't go straight anymore, and you must take the 90-degree turn to continue. If you didn't turn, you would run into one of those huge swinging metal gates with a field behind it. Well, yesterday, I had to give my 21-year-old nephew a doctor's appointment, and I used the GPS. We're turning onto the long road, then the road, and starting down it. The GPS says, in 100 feet, turn and left. We both say WTF, and he is saying, you gotta get that thing fixed, lol, and we're laughing. Well, we arrive at that section, and there was a left turn now where there had been a field. There was a whole neighborhood down there. Now we are both quiet, and he says, yo. Like, how and when did this get here? We drive that road every day. I am still weirded out today. I even asked my husband, and he laughed at me, saying, there's no left turn. I have to go check to see if it's still there today. I don't live super rurally anymore, but my parents still do. I was visiting them last summer and was just leaving when this strange noise popped up. It's farm country and heavily forested, so there are lots of noises out there. I may not know what each of them is, but most noises you'd hear out there, I was familiar with. This one was completely new. It was sort of like a cross between a siren and an animal howling. Occasionally, you'd hear sirens from the highway or train horns, but the animals typically ignore those. But this one was different. Every animal within a 10-mile radius went absolutely nuts. Dogs, coyotes, birds, and cows. Every goddamn type of animal around was howling, squawking, and making as much noise as they could. All the animals I could see or hear moving around were very active. The neighbors across the street had a pen with various animals, and they were, like, stampeding around the pen. There was a random selection of small animals eating the cat food my parents leave out for the barn cats, like 2 possums, a raccoon, and a feral cat. I heard the noise and immediately ran for the hills. I don't remember how long it lasted, maybe 3 minutes or so, but then it just ended as soon as it began. It freaked me the hell out. It was seriously like the hell mouth was opening up. That's how creepy it was. I have never heard that noise before or since, and I have no idea why the animals reacted the way they did. I was in the car with my mom, the driver, and my fiancé. We'd been to some shops in a rural village near our hometown. On our way back, we followed the route like we always do. We came to our usual T-junction with road signs at the top indicating village, hometown. The village only has 2 exits and entrances. We drove in one and out the other. So we turn right, like we always do, as directed. We drive along the country road and then realize we're somehow driving back towards the village. Driving past the same shops we had just driven away from, we'd driven in a loop. We drove down the same road, all freaked out, pointing out certain landmarks we had passed earlier. Knowing we had driven the right route. We come to the same T-junction. Village, hometown, take the right exit towards your hometown. This time we make it back to our hometown. There are no turnoffs you can accidentally go down as it's a narrow country road with ditches and rivers either side. So we know we didn't make a mistake. It still freaks us out to this day. My only argument is that we must have had a fatal car crash in a different multiverse and woke up in this one. Because what other plausible explanation is there? I am so scared over this that I still can't sleep. I decided to do Lyft as a side hustle, and around 4 a.m. this morning, it was time for me to take people to work and for them to start their day. A side note, I never believed in this whole Matrix thing or parallel universe, but this is mildly alarming to me. I took these passengers to Phoenix, and we were saying how I could literally just finish up after that ride and go home since I lived just 5 minutes west of them. I dropped them off. I vividly remember looking at my compass on the digital screen of my car and proceeding west on the road I've taken literally hundreds of times. I can see the high-rises and skyscrapers. I love the city so much, and I remember admiring it because the city looks so pretty under the cold, dark November sky. I was with cars following light traffic. A white Nissan was in front of me. I took a glance at my speed to make sure I was following the speed limit, and I shit you not, when I looked up less than a second later, I was in a rural area where Scottsdale meets Mesa. No buildings. No houses. There were no street lights or cars. It was a desolate space with no one. I was so caught off guard. I looked at my compass, and I was driving east. I tried to logically debunk it, but I couldn't. I then had to look up directions for my home because I had no idea where I was. I remember feeling this vibe, and the closest thing I can describe it was of pending doom. I did not feel comfortable at all. Here's where it gets freaky. When going west, I go on Thomas, and I was on Thomas because my passengers were on Thomas. But when I looked up, I was on McDowell and Pima. Pima and McDowell are 20 minutes from where I live. How did I get 20 minutes away in a nanosecond in the opposite direction on a different road? I found a motorway, and it took the full 20 minutes to get to where I was before that freaky shift. I am so confused, and I don't know what it means. I ended Lyft early today, and I am still so shaken up. Has anyone experienced this? What does it mean? I grew up in the Appalachian Mountains. Completely rural. I lived in a valley community. My house was surrounded by forestry and mountains. When I was about 14, my dad started to hear strange sounds coming from the hills behind our house. Knocking sounds, as if something were hitting a tree, and the occasional inhuman yell. My dog, a rough and tough outside boy, was very drawn to those hills at random times. His ears would shoot up, and he'd quickly run up to the forest and stay for a while. His going up in the hills wasn't uncommon, but at the time, he started acting particularly suspicious about them. Anyway, the noises started to become more frequent. My brother and his friend used to hunt for ginseng up in the hills, and they heard the noises too, much louder, of course, since they were near the source. One day, the noises wouldn't stop. They progressed louder and louder, and there was growling. My brother was pretty much sick of it by now and wanted to know what the duck was up there after about a year of wondering. It's evening time, about to get dark, so he takes a flashlight and a shotgun and heads up into the hills. He sees a creature that looks like what he said could be a Sasquatch. It was tall, with broad shoulders wider than its torso. He also saw its silhouette because of the darkness that came. He chased it off, came back to the house, told me what happened, and drew a sketch of what it looked like. The noises had stopped after that day. They never came back. Oh, and a couple weeks later, a new Bigfoot special came on TV. A witness sketch of an alleged Bigfoot looked almost identical to the one my brother made. To this day, we're still convinced Bigfoot or some SHT lived there. My dad named him Sassy, short for Sasquatch. In 2007, I was a high school senior living in a desert in Southern California, in a small area known as the High Desert off the 15 freeway. The area is about 2 hours south of Las Vegas and about a 2.5-hour drive northeast of Los Angeles. Growing up there, my cousins and friends and I would always joke around about things like ghosts, aliens, or El Chupacabra. I'm sure many of you are familiar with that legend. I should add that my cousins and friends and I were always more willing to believe in the supernatural than dismiss it outright. One night I was talking to my best friend on the phone, like we did 3 or 4 times a week when we weren't hanging out. She started telling me a story that creeped me out. She was driving home the night before, at about 11:30 p.m. from her boyfriend's house, which was about a mile away, though dark, secluded dirt roads from her house. She said that while driving home, she caught sight of 2 red dots in the dark in front of her, about 4 feet up from the ground, just outside the view from her headlights. Scared and unsure of what it was, mountain lions and coyotes are known to prowl the area, but they don't have red eyes. She turned her brights on. That's when she flipped her shit. I'll never forget the sheer terror that came into her voice as she told me what she saw. We've been best friends now for 20 years, she's more like my sister, and I know everything about her. She has never been one to pull pranks on me or lie to me to freak me out. She was genuinely serious and absolutely horrified. She told me that when she turned on her lights, she was face to face with a creature she had never seen before. It stood only a couple hundred feet from her. It had 4 legs, which she described as resembling a dog's legs, but only stood on its hind 2. It was about 4 feet tall. It was black, it looked almost scaly and slick, like it had the skin of a lizard, and it was wet. Long spines stuck out from the back of its head to its tail. Its eyes were red, its jaw protruding like the long snout of a dog, and it had visible fangs, long incisors. What freaked her out the most, she said, was that it didn't seem to be afraid of her. Instead, she said it looked into her eyes, as if it were studying her and challenging her. After what seemed like an eternity, she said it jumped into the darkness of the desert. She flipped her car in reverse, spun around, and sped back to her boyfriend's house. She told me she cried and, being religious, prayed the whole way back. She said she couldn't keep her eyes out of her rearview mirror, afraid she would see it chasing her car. She was too terrified to even sleep. I got goosebumps just hearing her describe it. In fact, I still get scared thinking about it. To make the mood lighter, I told her I believed her, I do, and started joking that she saw El Chupacabra. She believed it was more demonic, but today we still jokingly refer to the creature, whatever it is, as El Chupacabra. Eventually, we got off the phone. I was so freaked out by the story that I felt compelled to share it, maybe to have my mom make me feel better. I went into the kitchen for a drink and found both my parents there, chatting at the table. I decided to tell them the story because I was visibly freaked out and wanted to laugh. I started describing the creature exactly as my friend had told me 15 minutes earlier. I was looking at my dad as I spoke, and I saw his face drop, his eyes widen, his jaw settle, and I could have sworn I saw his skin turn a little whiter. Before I could finish describing the thing, my mom interjected, grabbing my dad's elbow. "Oh my God. That sounds exactly like what you saw the other day." I stopped my story and looked at my mom for more explanation. My dad asked me to finish my story first. Once I did, my dad told me he had seen the exact same creature 3 days before, in the early morning, on his way to work. At that time, he worked in construction, about 2 hours away from home. He had to be at work at 5 a.m. and would leave our house about 3 a.m. each day. He told me as he drove to work through the mountains, in an area about 20 minutes west of where my best friend had her encounter, that he caught something moving next to his car from the side of his eye. At that time, it's very dark. He traveled long, windy mountain roads with no streetlights around, but he said he saw something blacker than black moving at pace with his car in the trees. He stopped his car, thinking maybe he was still half asleep. Pulling over onto a lookout stop, he parked the car facing the road. He left his lights on. Then he saw the same sort of creature walk into the light of his headlights. It looked into the car from about 100 feet away, still on the road. It noticed him. It was aware of him. Then it turned and jumped back into the darkness the way it came. My dad said he never hit his gas pedal so hard or so fast. It freaks me out to this day. We don't know what it is, but something is definitely out there in that desert, and it's not afraid of humans. This happened around 1 to 2 years ago. I think I was in 9th grade when this occurred. Anyway, I, 16, live in rural northern Maine. Winter usually starts around November, and this incident happened around my birthday, around the middle of the month. My mom left for a cruise that week, so it was just my brother and me. My dog, Daisy, sleeps with me when my mom is gone, so she can wake me up to go pee, eat, etc. It was around 3 a.m. when Daisy started freaking out and wanting to go outside. She's an old dog, so I didn't want to have her pee in the house, so I went and let her out. She suddenly bolts and heads to the back of the house where our field is, we are farmers, and starts barking so aggressively. I immediately go out because it is freaking 3 in the morning, and I don't want to wake anyone up. I grab Daisy's collar, and at this time we are by the side of the house. I looked up, and in the middle of the snow-covered field, I could clearly make out a long black human figure standing there. It was about 100 yards away, so I couldn't make out any distinctive details. All I remember was how big it was and how it stood out so well from the white snow. We stared at each other for probably 20 seconds when I let out a huge gasp. I really thought I was going to die in that moment. Mainly because Daisy wasn't going after it, which is highly unusual since she is a German Shepherd. For reference, a few weeks ago, she ran right up to a huge black bear and didn't seem to care. It was 3 times her size, she was just standing in front of me, barking. Daisy wouldn't leave my side. After that, I ran back inside with her and promptly jumped in my bed. I was terrified, and I've only recently told anyone what happened. Mostly out of fear that they would think I was lying. And because I haven't seen anything like it since then, since I live in northern Maine, could it possibly be a Wendigo? I've heard stories originating from the Micmac tribe in Maine. Although it could possibly be a Chenu as it comes out during the winter months, the main thing I wonder is why it didn't kill me. Not to sound like a complete loser, but I would be very easy to kill, and I was literally in my pajamas. What are your thoughts about this? Am I completely nuts? On a cross-country motorcycle trip, I ended up taking a dirt road through the Appalachian Mountains and getting temporarily lost. I ended up coming upon a tiny mountain village somewhere on the West Virginia border. The village had maybe 10 houses, all of which looked like 100-year-old sheds, completely ramshackle and falling apart with weeds and rusting junk all around the houses. I puttered through the village to a T intersection and took one of the 2 road choices. What was really strange is that the entire village was silent. I didn't see a single person as I slowly rode through the village. The road I took ended a few hundred yards from the intersection, at the edge of the village. The road just ended at a tree line in a forest. Strange. So I turned around and headed back towards the T-junction, the center of the village, to take the other road. I then noticed that dozens of people had appeared. They were all standing perfectly still on their porches, in doorways, and among the junk in their front yards, staring at me. Every single person was black, the only black village I saw in Appalachia. They wore stereotypical hillbilly clothes, like you'd see on the TV show Hee Haw in the 1970s, that were tattered, torn, and filthy. I slowly puttered to the T intersection at the center of the village and realized that I was surrounded on all sides by these black hillbillies staring at me, completely motionless, with the exception of their heads moving to continue to stare at me as I slowly rode past them. My hair stood on end. I made the turn without stopping. I had a feeling that I'd never be found again if I stalled out and couldn't get the bike started again for some reason. They all had blank facial expressions. They didn't exactly look mean, but not one of them looked friendly either, and every single one of them was just intensely staring at me. I hauled ass out of there as fast as I could. I traveled hundreds and hundreds of miles through backcountry roads and dirt roads in Appalachia. I never saw anything like this strange village, filled with what looked like black hillbilly zombies. Strange. Bisbee, Arizona. I went there on a ghost hunting excursion with my girl for Valentine's Day a few years ago. The town is way out in the middle of nowhere. We drove through Tombstone, which has some sketchy history itself. But nowhere in my life has compared to the creepiness that is Bisbee. It's an old mining town, sort of like Silent Hill or something. The entire town is very old and is built vertically into the hills and mountains where they mined. Walking around the town, wandering in and out of hotels, restaurants, and stores, you get this very weird vibe. I wandered into a bed and breakfast that was unlocked. Nobody was inside. I just walked around the first floor of this old creepy house, went into the kitchen, and saw some lights on in some of the rooms. The residential areas are all built sort of vertically, too, and walking around is like being in an M.C. Escher drawing. I saw a building I wanted to check out but couldn't figure out how to walk there. I kept walking into dead ends and strange turnabouts. Watching videos or looking at pictures of Bisbee is nothing at all like being there. If you ever get the chance, I highly recommend checking it out. I grew up in the southern Appalachians, the Crab Orchard Mountains, to be kind of precise. My much older brother and his best friend saw a Bigfoot in the 1960s while camping on the Obed River. No guessing about it. I always believed him. A buddy and I were back there in the early 00s, late January. We're camping and riding ATVs, and it's staying around -8 degrees Fahrenheit that night. We were back at the camp, warming around the fire, quietly talking. All of a sudden, the most ear-piercing bellowing or screaming of a sort that I have never heard anywhere on this planet. It had the volume of a ducking elephant, it seemed. It moved around our campsite in the dark, staying out of the glow of the campfire. Jerry shined his big head-bashing flashlight all around, and we didn't see anything, but it screamed at us another 3 times, and then we heard what sounded like a damn moose running through the woods. There aren't any moose around there, let me tell you. My brother and Jerry kept our handguns handy for a couple more hours, talking about what just happened. I asked him, you know what it had to be, don't you? And he said the words, but to this day, he doesn't even like to talk about it with me. It changed his perception of what is out in those woods, though, before that, he was Mr. Nothingscaressin. He doesn't even go out in the boonies anywhere near as much as he did before that night. If I'm lying, I'm dying. Well, you know what I'm saying. It's the truth. My 30-year-old has been plagued with shadow people for years. The most bizarre incident occurred in December 2012. My son-in-law was driving, and she was in the passenger seat. They were on a lonely stretch of a rural road in Findlay, Tennessee, late at night. There were no other drivers around for miles. After driving a bit, she began noticing black entities every now and then and thought maybe she was tired or her eyes were acting up. This gave her notice to figure out what it was, so she decided to focus better the next time it happened. About 20 seconds later, what she observed panicked her. On both sides of the road, the headlights caught a group of 6 or 7 shadow people. As soon as the car neared them, they would all quickly flit away. She asked her husband if he noticed anything odd, and he said no but asked why. He doesn't believe in the paranormal unless it only happens to him. She didn't want him to laugh at her, so she said, "Oh, nothing, I must be tired is all." As they drove, she began timing the sightings and found that every 20 seconds, different groups would appear. This went on for about 10 minutes until the last time, when a shadow person the size of a toddler with a very large head was crawling on all 4s across the middle of the road. It turned and looked at the car, and she felt like it saw her. At that moment, it got on its feet and ran into the field. As if on cue, the rest merely flitted away into the air. I am originally from rural northern Ontario, Canada, and have always spent most of my time in the woods or in nature, regardless of where we moved. Over the years, I've seen some weird stuff, but this experience surely takes the cake. When I was 16 years old, living with my mom in rural-ish NJ, USA, my best friend and I had an experience that we both still remember vividly, and my wife wants me to share the story to see what people think we saw. My buddy and I used to cut through this farmer's field between my mom's neighborhood and our local mall for maybe a mile or so. It rarely had crops over the years, maybe 1 year of corn in the few years I cut through it, if I remember right. The field was barren on this day, and we were headed to the mall to hang out. We didn't notice anything unusual on the way to the mall through the field. We stayed in the mall for about an hour or two and went back through the field to get back to my mom. We didn't drink or eat anything in the mall that I remember, no drug usage or alcohol either. When we got to the tree line between the field and the mall, we saw a handful of people, all dressed somewhat similar in overalls of some sort and plaid shirts, collecting things off the ground. I figured they were harmless, and we knew the old guy's name who owned the field, so we probably wouldn't get yelled at if we name dropped. As we made our way through the field and got closer, I remember feeling a lot of static energy. It looked like they were picking up smoking coals off the ground and throwing them in buckets. Weird, but we didn't say anything to these folks and just kind of skirted around them till we were nearing the tree line back to my mom's neighborhood. We heard a loud whooshing noise, sort of like an air compressor. We turned back, and there was a group of 6 identical white-suited men with Daft Punk-esque helmets that seemed to be shooting, silently like their weapons made no noise, at the folks picking those things up off the ground. Their side arms looked like the guns used to spread weed killer or a paint sprayer, really long and thin. They didn't seem to notice us watching until my friend went into a panic and started freaking out. I grabbed him by his shirt and started dragging him towards the tree line, but he was in some sort of shock. I looked back as we were running, and they were all facing us but not pursuing. My friend went home, and we didn't talk to each other for about a week. Everyone we told to date has said we were mad, minus my wife and father. I will say that after the initial whoosh, we never heard another noise, not even a cricket, for the whole encounter until we made it back across the tree line. I live in a small town near Denton, Texas, home of the locally infamous Goatman's Bridge. The bridge was once home to a goat herder named Oscar Washburn, locally referred to as the Goat Man, in 1938, during the prime of the Ku Klux Klan in my city. Oscar made a fair living selling his cheese, milk, and fur from his goats and his wife's yarn and textile business. Seeing as they were African Americans and doing fairly well for themselves during that time period, the local whites got upset, as you could imagine. The Klan lured Oscar outside of his home one night, kidnapped him, and took him to the bridge close to his home. They tied a noose around the bridge and, subsequently, his neck, and threw him overboard in an attempt to lynch the man. According to the story, the Klansmen looked over the edge only to find that Oscar was not, in fact, hanging by the noose. Nobody was. He had disappeared without a trace and perhaps escaped the grasp of the Klan. In a fit of rage, the Klansmen burned down Oscar's home, which was occupied by his wife and children. The entire Washburn family was ended that night, or so they think, and ever since there has been reported haunting and paranormal activity at the bridge. Some are claiming it to be Oscar coming back for vengeance. The Goatman's Bridge was featured in an episode of Ghost Adventures on the Travel Channel. Though I'm sure the show is fake, I've had my own experiences at the bridge. On my first date with my current girlfriend, we decided to go to the bridge. It's a common destination for teens or anyone else in the city to go to in order to get their spooky fix. As we were walking through the woods, we came to a bank by the river. I personally didn't see anything other than what appeared to be a small wooden dock with a fire and a small boat. My girlfriend claims that she saw a man sitting on the dock by the fire rubbing his hands together, and so she told me adamantly that we should head back. I personally didn't see the man, but coupled with the strange noises of the woods, strange satanic writings all around the place, and goat hoof prints, we decided to leave. Fast forward several months later, and we decided to go back for another date. We had walked the entire length of the river to find that dock. We must have walked up and down the bank 3 times, only to be astonished at the fact that it had disappeared. I know it seems far-fetched, but my girlfriend and I were no more than 2 feet from each other when she saw the man, and she's not one to dramatize or lie for the sake of theatrical effect. I'm not sure what we saw that night, but I don't doubt it was supernatural in some way. A small family, a mother, a father, and a 2-year-old, set their house on fire while being inside, effectively ending themselves and destroying the whole house. They were poor, had the child unexpectedly, and needed their own house. They put all their money and a lot of work into their new house, but after it was done, one of the people they worked with screwed them over, and suddenly they had a huge debt on their names because that person didn't put the money where it should have been, and instead in his own pockets. The house was supposed to be auctioned off after they couldn't prove that they actually paid money, and they decided to end it so they wouldn't have to live with the shame. It was a pretty extreme story for my small town, and the burned ruins remained untouched for a long time. The house I grew up in had a basement that was a Midwest speakeasy during the Prohibition era, 1920s early 30s. The original wooden bar setup and paneled mirror walls were still there when we moved in, almost 90 years later. It's rumored that Elliot Ness, the investigator who eventually caught Al Capone, the famous mobster operating in Chicago and the Midwest, was a regular at this speakeasy in my basement. Basically, the house is super old and has a lot of history. As a kid, I was always scared to be in that basement alone. A few times, I felt a strange coldness brush past my leg or back or something, and I vividly remember always getting the feeling someone was behind me and then running up the stairs as fast as I could. One time, my friends and I were playing down there in a back room that had a heavy wooden barn door that stood between it and the main part of the basement. It used to be an outside door before the house was added. The door mysteriously locked, it couldn't be locked from our side of the door, and it took my dad like 20 minutes to get it open again and let us out. After we moved out of that house, my whole family discovered each of us had had these weird experiences but chalked them up to chance or weird coincidences. Looking back, I would not be surprised if that basement was haunted by a few mischievous, alcohol-sneaking ghosts. A few years ago, I got lost in rural Missouri. Super lost. Like backcountry roads lost. So if I get directions from a gas station where the worker is super pissed, I won't buy his overpriced map. So he gives me directions that include going down this road to this other road to get to the highway to get to the interstate. So I go down this back road and end up in this town. It's like 2 p.m. And completely dead. There was not a single person around. Mostly older houses, run down downtown, new post office, that kind of thing. And I'm suddenly filled with dread. Like Stephen King's Dread. There's trash blowing everywhere, and there's just nobody. I drive by the library, and it's pretty much abandoned. There are oversized books in the window, and they're completely swollen, like water. So I make it out of town, keep heading on my way, and make it safely to my destination. Later on, I search the town, and it's insane. In a town that size, it's full of gruesome murders from the 1800s. That kind of thing. It's called Skidmore, Missouri, and it's creeped me out more than any other place on the 3 continents I've been to. One night, my uncle was driving back from town through the country to his home. It was not an area that he was familiar with, it was farm country with few homes and large distances between them. He ran out of gas. He walked up the road to the first farmhouse. There was a gas pump out front, as many farmers keep a decent supply on hand. He walked up the driveway and knocked on the door. An elderly couple answered, and he explained his situation. They were kind and happy to help. The husband got him a can, and they went to the pump, and he put a couple of gallons of gas from the pump into the can. My uncle walked back to the car and put the gas in the tank. He brought the can back and offered them some money for the gas. They wouldn't take any money and just said they were glad they could help. He thanked them and drove home. My uncle looks like a lumberjack. He was 6'6" inches tall, over 300 pounds, and had a full beard. He was one of those gentle giants, and although you would never guess it by looking at him, one of his favorite things was to bake pies. So the next day, he bakes a pecan pie to bring back to the couple who gave him the gas. He drove back to the house and knocked on the door, but nobody was home. He drove down the road to the next house and went to the door to see if he could leave the pie with the neighbors. When he talked to the neighbors, they told him the house he was talking about had been abandoned. Figuring he must have gone to the wrong house, he drove along the road looking for the right place. When he couldn't find another farmhouse that looked anything like the one he got the gas from, he drove back a second time. The gas pump was there, and he was sure that it was the right house, but it was empty. He went back to the neighbors again and said he had been to the house the night before, and an elderly couple had given him gas. He described them to the neighbors, and they said, "The people you're describing used to live there, but they've been dead for years." After he told the story, I asked him what he thought, and he said he couldn't explain it. He went back to the farm to check the pump, and it wasn't working. This was the only story of this kind I had ever heard him tell. He wasn't a boaster or an exaggerator, and he told the story sort of factually, like, "I don't know, I can't explain it." This really happened, and it's one of the most unnerving things. So, it was the 4th of July, and my brother and I were setting off fireworks in the woods behind our house. We were passing back and forth an aim and flame cigarette lighter, lighting firecrackers, and other small fireworks. It was around 2 in the morning on July 5th. I left to get something to drink and left my brother there, lighting fireworks. I get back around 10 minutes later, and he asks me for the lighter. I told him I didn't have it. I left it with him, and he was actively lighting firecrackers as I left. He says, "Yeah, I know. But I just gave it to you a couple minutes ago. Where is it?" I know my brother. This isn't something he'd lie about. We've talked about it many times over the years, and the story has never changed. The moon was bright that night. Bright enough to see. He says he saw me in my same outfit. Same face, same hair, and everything. Apparently, the doppelganger said nothing, went up, and put his hand out. My brother assumed it was wanting the lighter. He gave him the lighter, and whatever it was, he walked away. I never said a word. These were woods privately owned by my family. Far out in rural Texas. Nobody else was out there. And if they were, that doesn't explain how they looked exactly like me. We continued setting off firecrackers until around 4 in the morning. I had to use a short cigarette lighter because the thing stole aim and flame. Pretty creepy. This happened to me and 2 of my cousins when I was 17 years old. One of them was 15, and the other was 13. If I recall correctly, this was January 5, 2003. We are from a rural area in Spain, and by that time, it was hard to get lines on our mobile phones, so we used to spend a lot of time in the spots where we could get some. One was an abandoned house beside a path leaving the town. It was around 2000 hours, and one of my cousins was talking by phone with his girlfriend while I was there standing, just looking at the stars. Suddenly I saw it. The lights looked like plain lights, but all were orange. It was so low that I could see bits of structure surrounding the lights, and it looked bulky and not aerodynamic. It crossed the sky above us, zigzagging and changing direction many times. I called for the attention of my cousins, and both were amazed as I looked at the object. The younger one started using the voice recorder on his phone to record a depiction of what we were seeing. And this was the strangest part. When it reached the horizon line, above the mountains, it blew up, turning into a fireball. We didn't see anything fall, it disintegrated. And we kept looking there for a while, just to notice there was a lot of activity. Many small lights were flying around the area of the explosion. We stood on there for a while, silently, not knowing what to say, Until my youngest cousin tried to play the voice record, which he did, and it was full of interferences with weird sounds and static, something that never happened. He used to do voice recordings when something memorable happened to him. Just after that, things got mad or funny as his phone started ringing, and casually, it had the X-Files theme as its tone. We already knew the phone had that tone, but the timing was perfect. At that moment, I just managed to say, with a scared voice, "Okay, this just went weird. Time to leave." About 6 months ago, I was driving on the extremely rural highway near my house, heading to work, when there was suddenly a block of traffic where usually I'd see little to no other cars, even at peak times of day. It turns out a car, a black Chevy HHR, to be exact, was ablaze on the right side in the little median place between the highway and the entrance ramp of the road one to the west of mine. Of course everyone was stopping to do the slow merge to get into the shoulder while gawking, so I got a good look. I followed the crawl of traffic around the makeshift barrier the police set up and watched as the fire crew tried to put the huge flames out. According to the online dispatch report, no one died, but the driver was apparently hurt. Then 2 months after that, I was driving on the same highway to my boyfriend's place around the same time of day as the first event. As I was crossing the first mile of the highway, I noticed a big line of brake lights in the distance, and sure enough, it was another blocked traffic situation. I could see from my position uphill, slightly east of the exit, that another car was on fire in the same median. As I approached the exit, intending to just get off there and avoid the traffic by using back roads, I noticed the blazing car had the distinct shape of an HHR. I took the exit and purposefully turned left to drive on the overpass slowly and looked down to confirm that, sure enough, it was another dark-colored HHR engulfed in flames in the same exact place. A fire crew was fighting it the same way behind their makeshift barrier of trucks and police. The only difference is that I didn't see anything on the online dispatch report later, like the first time. So was there a recall on HHRs for spontaneous combustion? How'd they happen to blow into the same place on an extremely rural highway coming from an even more rural back road? Maybe there's an archer shooting flaming arrows at HHRs getting onto the highway from the woods nearby. Or maybe it was a glitch in the matrix. Either way, it was pretty strange. I come from Britain, in a small little town that's pretty much bang in the middle of rural Scotland. Anyway, as you may or may not know, Scotland is known to be a foggy and quite rainy place, so I wasn't surprised to see a deep fog as me and my girlfriend drove through the middle of a miniature valley with hills on either side that were pretty secluded. Nobody was in sight, and it was around 6 p.m., so little light was left. As we drove, my girlfriend checked her phone to see the time, 6:03 exactly, and said we should get home. The drive had taken roughly 1 hour driving pretty much straight the whole way to get where we were, so you can probably understand our surprise when, about 10 minutes after 10 minutes of pure fog and rain, the fog literally just seemed to lift and disappear and the rain immediately stopped, and we were right in front of her house. The car was still running, and the digital clock on it wasn't on the dashboard anymore. We both recognized that we had only taken 10 minutes, as we had only listened to a couple songs that lasted max 5 minutes each, so when my girlfriend checked her phone, which had now turned off on its own despite having 90% battery left, it was exactly 10:05 p.m., so we had gone for more than 4 hours on a drive that should have taken 1 hour but only lasted 2 songs, aka 10 minutes. What the duck happened? Also, so I don't get hit with the "you're doing this too much," I guess I'll just add it on here, I've recently had dreams of events that haven't happened yet. For example, thinking of an empty park in the early morning, a cyclist in blue clothing cycles past and skids into a bench. The next day, I went to the park with my girlfriend, and the exact same thing happened. The same clothes, skidding, bike making, and so on. I recently moved into my own place after living with my now ex-boyfriend for 2 years. During my time there, I had some pretty strange experiences. A little background on the house: it was my ex's childhood home. He lived there for 25 years. It used to be a quail ranch and sits on 80+ acres. He had paranormal experiences in the home as a child but has since rationalized his experiences and chooses to no longer believe anything paranormal. Shortly after moving in, I noticed a particularly bad feeling in the back bedroom. When my boyfriend would leave for work and I would be alone in the room, I would be awoken by a sense of dread that something was there. I would experience sleep paralysis frequently and be unable to wake myself up, which became so exhausting emotionally that I requested he wake me before leaving so I could get up and go to sleep in the living room. Things would occur in the house, like doors opening by themselves, strange noises, and things being moved, but where I felt most uncomfortable was outside. When I would go outside, especially after dark, I got a strong sense of being watched, followed, or that something was coming up behind me. I would often hear what sounded like a person trying to imitate a poor animal, like an owl. I would tell my boyfriend about the experiences, and it seemed to get worse. One night, my boyfriend and I and our children decided to go camping on the hill of the property. I worked that day, so despite feeling uncomfortable, I fell asleep pretty quickly. The next morning, my boyfriend's 11-year-old son asked me when I moved back to my spot because he saw me sleeping next to my 6-year-old son. I told him I had not moved because I was sleeping next to the baby, who was only 3 months old at the time, and I was worried about him getting cold. My boyfriend was next to me, and the only other people in the tent were the 11-year-old and 6-year-old sleeping in the back corners. It was a very large tent that sleeps 10 people, so there was quite a bit of space between us and the kids, and he insisted he definitely saw an adult laying next to my son, and he just assumed it was me and went back to sleep. We just shrugged the experience off as him being half asleep and not knowing what he saw. We got up, went back to the house, and got the kids ready for school. We had intended to go back and retrieve the tent and sleeping bags later in the day, but laziness took over, and we didn't retrieve them until 2 days later. When we entered the tent, we were immediately hit with a horrendous smell that was like a mix between rotting meat and the smell some homeless people get from not bathing for a very long time. It made us nauseated, but we packed up the stuff anyway and left the sleeping bags outside to air out. The smell never went away, and we ended up discarding them, assuming an animal had gotten in the tent or something. After that, the experience seemed to increase. My boyfriend always slept with the room pitch black, not even a light from an alarm clock or the little red charging light on the cell phone could be visible, and one night I was awoken by the sound of heavy breathing about a foot away from my face. It was dark, and I couldn't see. I was still groggy when I was about to tell my 6-year-old son, who had a habit of getting out of bed in the middle of the night, to go back to his room when I remembered my son was at his grandmother's house for the weekend, and the only ones there were myself and my boyfriend. After that hit me, the breathing still continued, and I rolled over quickly and got as close to my boyfriend as possible and shook him to wake him up. As I shook him, the breathing stopped. I told him there was someone in the room. He was half asleep, turned, and used his cell phone light to scan the room. So he went back to sleep and was soon snoring. After that, I slept close to him with my back turned towards where the breathing was, and for a solid hour, I could feel something poking me on the back through the blanket, like it was trying to get my attention. I ignored it and clung tightly to my boyfriend, and I was too afraid to turn and look, imagining I would see some horrible, grotesque-looking figure if I did. Another incident: my friend was visiting one night and was dropped off at the end of the driveway, which was a long dirt road leading to the house. She came into the house panicked and said something was walking behind her up the driveway, but she too was too afraid to look and also had the feeling that if she acknowledged it, it would only be worse. My son, who would sleep in the room at the front of the house, was terrified of sleeping alone, a problem I never had with him before. It was a battle every night to get him to sleep. He said he was afraid because there was a scary face at his window. He had broken the curtain rod, so his window was uncovered. I would tell him there was nothing there, but every morning I would wake him up for school. He was out of bed and sleeping on the couch. Many animals disappeared while I lived there: 10 cats, 2 chickens, and a large lab/Rottie mixed dog. We assumed coyotes got them but never heard any noise and never found any trace of them, except once we found the remnants of one animal, which we assumed was one of the cats laid out on top of the barbecue. It was just chunks of flesh and fur whatever had gotten. It didn't leave much behind, there weren't even any bones. I have had other paranormal experiences, but something about this one felt different, almost like the whole property itself was haunted, not just the house.